The argument began at midnight, just as I was settling into bed with my crossword puzzle. A woman's shrill voice sliced through the thin walls, followed by a man's slurred retort and the thud of something heavy against the plaster. I set the pencil down and pressed my palm against the wall as if my hand could muffle the chaos. It never did. After 20 years in this condo, I should have been used to it, the late-night bickering, the pounding television, the children crying down the hall. But each sound reminded me of how fragile my peace had become. I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, listening. My husband Harold had always said we'd finish our days somewhere quiet, perhaps a small cottage tucked under the arms of oak trees. He'd painted pictures with his words of roses, climbing a white trellis of a porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze. That dream had died with him 6 years ago, and I had let it stay buried until now. The next morning, still weary from broken sleep, I found myself scrolling through property listings on my laptop, sipping coffee that had gone cold before I realized it. The numbers scared me, even though I had been careful with Harold's pension and the savings from decades of teaching. But the more I looked, the more I felt that if I didn't make a change now, I never would. I called a realtor whose name I had scribbled on the back of a church bulletin. Weeks earlier, Alden Realty, Small Town Homes, Big Dreams. It sounded corny, but at that moment, it also sounded like hope. When I walked into their office that afternoon, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon polish. A row of cheerful photographs of tidy suburban houses lined the walls. I was adjusting the strap of my purse when a familiar voice reached me from the reception desk. "I'm looking for something modest," the man said. "Nothing too far out of town. 2 bedrooms, maybe 3. Something I can move into quickly." My heart stopped. The voice was unmistakable. It was Darian, my only son. I froze, half hidden behind a display of flyers. He was dressed in his office slacks, sleeves rolled up, hair neatly combed. He leaned across the desk, speaking low to the receptionist, as if sharing something confidential. I couldn't hear all the words, only fragments. "Affordable. Paperwork ready. Sooner the better." The young woman nodded briskly and handed him a clipboard. Darian didn't notice me. He was too focused, too intent on whatever arrangement he was making. I ducked back, my pulse quickening. Of all the places in town, why here? Why now I had come to chase Harold's dream, to step toward the quiet I craved. And suddenly, there was my son at the same agency, searching for something he hadn't told me about. When he left, I remained pressed against the wall, waiting until the sound of his shoes faded through the glass doors. Only then did I step forward. The receptionist looked at me puzzled, but I forced a smile and gave my name. She slid the same clipboard toward me, and I steadied my trembling hand to write. While she typed into her computer, I stared at the empty chair Darian had occupied. My thoughts tumbled. Was he moving, planning to surprise me with news of a new place for his family? Or had he been prying into my own affairs, trying to find out where I might go if I left the condo? The coincidence felt too sharp, too sudden, to be nothing. I accepted a stack of listings from the receptionist, tucked them under my arm, and walked out into the afternoon sun. The street was loud with traffic horns bleating, brakes squealing, and for a moment, I longed so fiercely for Harold's imagined roses and porch swing that my eyes burned. I knew one thing as I started my car: I would not tell Darian what I was doing. Not yet. Maybe not ever. When I pulled onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The realtor's office shrank into the distance, and so did the shadow of my son's figure at the desk, bent over paperwork he hadn't wanted me to see. Was he simply searching for his own new home? Or searching for mine? The listings lay spread across my kitchen table like playing cards, each one promising an escape. Some houses were too large, some too modern, but 1 or 2 whispered to me with their porches and trees. I kept circling back to them, imagining what it would feel like to walk through a front door that was mine alone. For the first time since Harold's funeral, I felt a flicker of excitement rise above the grief that had settled in my bones. I wanted to share it with someone, but not with Darian. Not after the way he'd scolded me last Christmas for spending too much on Ezra's gifts. He had said it so gently, but the message was clear. My money needed to be managed preferably by him. I stared at the phone for a long time, tempted to call and tell him anyway, to hear his voice reassure me that he was happy for me. But I remembered the sight of him at that realtor's desk, leaning forward, as if the future he wanted depended on what was written on those forms. Whatever he was planning, he hadn't told me. That was reason enough to keep my own plans to myself. The next morning, I walked through a neighborhood on the edge of town, the kind with wide streets shaded by old oaks. A modest white cottage caught my eye, its front door painted a bold red. The lawn was tidy, but the real charm was next door, a garden alive with color. Roses in every shade climbed trellises and spilled across hedges, their fragrance drifting into the air. A woman knelt among them, wearing a straw hat and thick gloves. She straightened when she saw me watching. Her face was lined, but her smile was bright and warm. "Morning," she called. "You're new around here." "Just looking," I answered, stepping closer. "I'm thinking about buying in this area." "Well, you'd be welcome." "My name's Lou Henderson, but everyone calls me Mrs. Henderson." She removed one glove and offered her hand over the fence. "I've been here 23 years. These roses have outlasted 2 hurricanes, 1 bad ice storm, and my Harold." The way she said it, soft, steady, told me we carried a similar weight. "I'm Margaret," I said, taking her hand. "I lost my Harold 6 years ago." Her eyes softened. "Then you'll understand why I talk to these roses. They keep me company when the nights get long." I found myself smiling in return. For a few minutes we spoke about soil and pruning, but under the words was something else: recognition. We were 2 women who had lived full lives and now carried our losses quietly, still trying to build something beautiful. When I finally walked away, I glanced once more at the cottage with the red door. I could see myself there with Mrs. Henderson's roses leaning over the fence like friendly neighbors. The image stayed with me all afternoon. By evening, I knew. I wasn't waiting for Darian's approval. I wasn't even going to mention it until the papers were signed and the keys rested in my hand. This decision was mine and mine alone. I closed the folder of listings and pressed my palm against the cover as though sealing a promise. Harold had wanted peace for us both. Now I would claim it for myself. Could I really buy a house of my own without telling my only child Sunday dinners had become a ritual I couldn't quite escape? Darian liked to insist on them claiming it was for tradition's sake, but I often suspected it was his way of keeping tabs on me. Still, I drove across town that evening, casserole balanced on the seat beside me, rehearsing small talk in my head. Corinne greeted me at the door with her usual polished smile. She had the kind of grace that seemed effortless. Hair perfectly pinned, lipstick never smudged. Ezra darted past her legs, waving a toy plane, and I bent to hug him before he zipped back toward the living room. The table was already set. When I walked in, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic filling the air. I placed my dish down and took my seat, the one they always left at the end. Darian poured me a glass of water and asked about my week, though his eyes stayed fixed on the carving knife he was sharpening. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Ezra chattered about his school project. Corinne bragged about a charity luncheon she'd helped organize, and I listened, nodding in the right places. But the words inside me pressed harder with each passing minute. Finally, when there was a lull, I set down my fork. "I've been looking at houses," I said. "Something small. A place with a yard." The air shifted immediately. Corinne's fork clinked against her plate. Ezra, oblivious, continued making airplane noises, but Darian's head snapped up. A house, he repeated. For what? For me, I answered, steadying my voice. The condo has grown too noisy. I want some peace. His brows drew together. Mom, that doesn't make sense. You don't need a whole house to yourself. You should be with us. We've got the space. Corinne and I have already talked about converting the den. You'd have everything you need. Corinne nodded quickly, but her smile was thin. It would be safer. And family belongs together. I felt my chest tighten. I appreciate the thought, but I want something of my own. Just a modest cottage. Nothing extravagant. Darian set the knife down with a sharp clatter. That's not practical. You're 66. You'd be rattling around in some empty place paying taxes, mowing lawns, things you can't manage alone. Here we can help you. It isn't about practicality, I said. It's about independence. Independence. He let out a dry laugh. Mom, you're not 25. You don't need independence. You need support. His words stung more than I wanted to admit. I'm not helpless, Darian. I never said you were. He countered his tone, softening just enough to sound reasonable. But why waste money on another property? Think about Ezra. College is around the corner. We could put that money to better use as a family. There it was. The slip of truth. My savings weren't just mine in his eyes, they were a resource to be managed, redirected, controlled. I set my hands in my lap to hide their trembling. This isn't about Ezra's future, I said quietly. This is about mine. Silence spread across the table like a shadow. Corinne glanced at Darian, waiting for him to rein me in. Ezra slurped his juice, unaware of the storm. Darian leaned forward, his voice low but firm. Mom, I'm telling you this because I care. Moving into some house alone, it's selfish. You'd be isolating yourself when you could be here with us. I met his gaze and saw not concern, but calculation. He wanted me under his roof within his reach where my choices could be shaped into his. The chicken grew cold on our plates. My appetite had vanished. I excused myself before dessert, ignoring Corinne's half-hearted protest, and gathered my things. Driving home, the night pressed heavy against the windshield. Darian's words replayed in my head, each one digging deeper. If even my own son thought I didn't deserve independence, who would? The office smelled faintly of paper and ink, that particular scent of contracts waiting to be signed. I sat at the polished table pen in hand, my heart thumping, like it did before every first day of school I ever taught. The realtor, a cheerful man named Mr. Garrison, slid the final document toward me. All that's left is your signature, Mrs. Elowin. Once it's down, the house is yours. I looked at the blank line, hesitating. Harold's voice drifted back from years ago, telling me about the little white house he once dreamed we'd retire in. I blinked hard, pressed the pen to the paper, and scrawled my name. When I set the pen down, relief and fear braided together inside me. It was done. No one could undo it. Not Darian, not Corinne, not even my own doubts. Mr. Garrison shook my hand, his smile wide. Congratulations, homeowner. 2 days later, I drove to the property with the new keys jingling in my purse. The outskirts of Charlottesville were quiet, the kind of quiet you could almost taste, thick with the smell of grass and damp earth. The streets were wide, lined with oak trees so large they stretched their limbs like cathedral arches. Then I saw it, my house. Modest, neat, nothing flashy. White siding, black shutters, a roof that needed a little attention, and a front door painted the boldest red I had ever seen. It stood there like a heartbeat, daring me to step through. The yard wasn't grand, but it was mine. The lawn sloped gently toward the street, and a few stubborn daisies poked up from the grass. Across the fence, Mrs. Henderson's roses leaned as if welcoming me back. She was outside, kneeling with her shears, and waved when she saw me. "You did it?" She called, her voice carrying easily across the quiet street. I smiled, and lifted the keys in response. My throat was too tight to say anything. Inside the house smelled faintly of fresh paint, mixed with something older, the scent of history clinging to the walls. The living room was bright with 2 wide windows letting in morning sun. The kitchen counters were plain but sturdy, the cabinets a little worn as though waiting for someone to love them again. I walked from room to room, touching everything. The bedroom at the back overlooked the yard where I pictured myself sipping coffee and listening to birds instead of traffic. The second bedroom, smaller, had a window facing Mrs. Henderson's garden. I thought about putting a sewing machine there, maybe a chair where I could read. Every step deepened my triumph and sharpened my guilt. I could hear Darian's voice telling me this was foolish, selfish, impractical. I could already imagine his frown when he discovered what I'd done. But that discovery would not come soon. Not yet. I opened the back door and stepped onto the small porch. The air was still touched by the sweetness of roses and the crispness of oak leaves rustling in the wind. I gripped the railing, letting the truth settle in. For the first time in years, I was standing on ground that belonged only to me. Mrs. Henderson called again from her yard. "When you're ready, I'll bring over some clippings. Roses grow better when they've got company." I laughed softly, the sound startling in my own ears. "I'll hold you to it," I answered, though inside, I wondered if company was what I truly wanted, or if solitude was the point of all this. As the sun dipped low and the first crickets began to sing, I turned back to the red door, its paint glowing like an ember in the evening light. I slid the key into the lock, hearing it click into place, and whispered to myself, almost like a prayer. Was I planting freedom, or a secret that would one day betray me? The first week in the cottage felt like stepping into a dream I was afraid someone might shake me awake from. Boxes were stacked in corners, dishes clattered as I figured out which cabinet made the most sense, and every night I walked room to room as though to reassure myself the walls still stood around me. But it was the garden that drew me most. Each morning, I found myself standing by the back porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the patchy grass and uneven flower beds. It looked tired, neglected, like a place waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. I thought of Harold and the stories he used to tell about his grandfather's roses. He'd said once in that wistful way of his that roses could outlive the hands that planted them. I wanted that, something that carried on even after me. So I bought Gloves, a spade, and a handful of rose bushes from the local nursery. The cashier raised her eyebrows when I insisted on 6 different varieties, but I only smiled. If Harold's dream was going to root here, I wasn't planting halfway. The soil was stubborn, clotted with stones and tangled roots. I sweated through my blouse knees, damp from kneeling in the dirt, but with each shovelful, I felt lighter. It wasn't just earth I was turning over. It was grief, regret, and all the restless nights in that noisy condo. By the time the bushes were lowered into place, my back ached, yet something inside me had eased. On the 3rd day of my digging, Mrs. Henderson leaned over the fence, her straw hat shading her face. "You're ambitious," she said, chuckling. "Most people start with 1 or 2. You're going for the whole orchestra." I wiped sweat from my forehead and grinned. If I'm going to plant, I might as well do it properly. She came around through her gate and joined me, showing me how to cut the stems clean, how not to be afraid of thorns. Her hands moved with the confidence of long practice, and I found myself relaxing under her instruction. We worked side by side for an hour, and I realized how much I had missed simple companionship, the kind not laced with judgment or expectation. When we finally sat on my porch steps, sipping lemonade she had brought over, she told me about her Harold, how he used to complain about the weeds but always admired her roses in bloom. We laughed at the coincidence of our husbands sharing a name, and something about it felt like fate's quiet nod. "You'll see," she said, patting my hand. Once the roses take, they'll remind you that beginnings aren't only for the young. That night, when I stepped outside to water the new plants, I thought about her words. The bushes looked fragile under the fading light, but they were alive. They were mine, and like me, they were starting again, even in the late season of life. Still, as I locked up and turned in for the night, an unease lingered beneath my satisfaction. I had built this fragile sanctuary on silence. Darian knew nothing about the cottage, about the roses that now guarded my door. The secret kept me safe for now, but secrets have a way of slipping loose no matter how carefully tended. Could this home ever stay mine if my family discovered it? I hadn't been back to the condo since the day I carried out the last of my boxes. The key still rested on my ring, but I had no reason to use it anymore. My life was here now, in the cottage, in the soil clinging under my fingernails, in the new routine of tea on the porch each evening. Still leaving it behind felt like leaving a door half open. On a Tuesday morning while I was kneeling in the garden clipping dead leaves, my phone began to ring. The screen lit up with Darian's name. I hesitated before answering, brushing the dirt from my hands onto my jeans. "Mom," his voice came sharp, almost accusing. "Where are you?" I frowned. "At home? Why?" "No, your condo. I stopped by to check in. The place is empty. Completely empty. No furniture, nothing. The curtains are gone. What's going on?" My heart stumbled in my chest. He had gone there without telling me, without asking. Of course he had. It was just like him to assume he could turn the key and walk in. My voice caught. I forced it steady. "I've been staying with a friend. You know how noisy the building is. I just needed some peace and quiet." There was a long pause, so quiet I thought the line had dropped. Then he said, low and skeptical, "A friend. Who just an old colleague from the school district." I lied. "She has a spare room. It's temporary." Darian exhaled through the phone, that familiar sound of him weighing whether to press further. "You should have told me. You can't just move out without saying anything. If you needed help, I would have arranged something. You don't have to run off and hide with strangers." The word hide struck me like a stone. I swallowed it down. "I didn't want to trouble you. It's only for a little while." His tone softened, but not kindly. More like a leash being tugged with less force. "Mom, you know I worry. Things like this, packing up and leaving it, isn't safe. If something happened to you, I wouldn't even know where to look." I clutched the phone tighter. Nothing happened. "I'm fine. Then let me stop by, meet this colleague of yours." Panic shot through me. No. She's private. She wouldn't appreciate visitors." "Mom." His voice dropped into that deep register he used when Ezra misbehaved. "I don't like this. It doesn't make sense." I forced a laugh. "Not everything has to make sense. I'm 66, Darian, not 16. I can spend a few weeks where I please." Silence again. Finally, he sighed. "All right, but promise me you'll call if you need anything." "I promise," I said, though the word tasted bitter. When the call ended, I sat back on my heels, staring at the roses. Their stems were thin but upright, trembling slightly in the breeze. I felt just as fragile, rooted in my choice, but shaken by how quickly Darian had discovered the truth. Well, part of it. That evening, Mrs. Henderson stopped by with a basket of tomatoes from her garden. We sat on the porch together, and I almost confessed everything: the condo, the lie, the fear in my chest. But I kept it to myself, smiling as though nothing were wrong. Later, as I closed the curtains against the dusk, my phone buzzed again. A single text from Darian glowed on the screen. "We'll talk more on Sunday. Don't do anything rash." I stood there in the quiet of my cottage, the roses swaying outside, and wondered which was stronger, his suspicion or my resolve. Had my son just accepted my lie or begun to unravel it? It felt strange planning a celebration without inviting my own family. but the thought of Darian's eyes narrowing at every detail made my stomach twist. A housewarming was supposed to be joy, not another lecture about practicality. So I chose carefully. I invited Mrs. Henderson, of course. She insisted on bringing her famous lemon bars. I called 2 women I used to teach alongside, both widowed like me, and a handful of neighbors I'd already exchanged waves with on my walks. It was a small group, no more than a dozen, but that was exactly what I wanted: people who could smile without strings attached. On Saturday afternoon, the cottage buzzed with voices. The kitchen counters held platters of sandwiches and bowls of fruit. I had set vases of fresh-cut roses on every surface, their petals softening the room like little bursts of forgiveness. Music played low in the background. Frank Sinatra, Harold's favorite, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was tiptoeing through someone else's life. Mrs. Henderson settled at the dining table with my former colleagues, laughing as she told a story about her roses surviving a winter storm. One of the younger neighbors, a woman named Colleen, with 2 small children, admired the red door and said she wished her own house had the same spirit. I beamed, pouring iced tea into her glass, thinking how Harold would have teased me for turning hostess again. No one asked why Darian wasn't there. That silence was a relief. The truth was simple. I hadn't told him. It was my secret, my refuge, and I wanted it to stay unspoiled. Later, when dusk fell, we carried our glasses onto the back porch. Fireflies blinked above the grass, and Mrs. Henderson nudged me gently with her elbow. "This is good for you," she said. "I can see it in your face. You belong here." I squeezed her hand, unable to say more. She was right. For the first time since Harold's passing, I belonged somewhere, not because of duty or expectation, but because I had chosen it. When the last guest left and the house grew quiet, I stood in the living room surrounded by empty glasses and crumbs. My body was tired, but my heart felt light. The cottage had been warmed not by obligation, not by appearances, but by genuine kindness. The next morning, as I rinsed dishes at the sink, my phone buzzed on the counter. A message from my cousin Lenore popped up. "Lovely home you've made, Margaret. So proud of you." I froze. I hadn't invited Lenore. I hadn't even told her. She lived 2 counties away, and we rarely spoke. My breath quickened as I reread the message, my fingers trembling over the screen. I typed back, "How did you know?" Her reply came quickly. "Darian mentioned it. Said he heard from family. He sounded surprised you hadn't told him yourself." I shut my eyes, the dishwater cooling against my hands. The walls of the cottage, which had felt so protective last night, seemed suddenly porous. Someone had spoken, passed along what was meant to be mine alone. Whether by accident or intention, the secret was slipping. I dried my hands slowly and set the phone down, staring at the roses outside the window. Their stems stood tall, despite the summer heat, defiant and beautiful. But even roses, I reminded myself, could be cut down if someone decided they belonged elsewhere. Who had whispered my secret to him, and what would he do with it? The knock came just as I was clearing away the breakfast dishes. It was firm, purposeful, not the hesitant tap of a neighbor or the polite rap of a delivery man. I dried my hands on a towel and opened the red door. There they were, Darian, Corinne, and little Ezra, lined up as if for a portrait. "Surprise, Darian said, his smile tight but practiced. "We thought we'd stop by and see the famous house everyone keeps talking about." My throat went dry. For a moment, I considered pretending they had the wrong address, but Ezra threw his arms around my waist before I could find the words. His innocence disarmed me, and suddenly they were inside their shoes, clattering against the hardwood floors. Corinne's eyes swept the room with open admiration. "It's lovely, Margaret," she said, placing a hand on the back of my chair. "So cozy. You've done well for yourself." Her tone was warm, but something in the way she lingered over the word yourself stung. Darian walked slowly through the living room, his gaze sharp, taking in every corner as if cataloging it. "I'll admit I wasn't sure what to expect," he said, "but this is better than I thought." I forced a smile and poured lemonade, setting the glasses on the table. Ezra climbed into a chair, swinging his legs, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him. Neighbors had warned me word spreads quickly in small communities. I should have known that my secret couldn't last forever. Still, seeing them here uninvited felt like an intrusion into something sacred. We sat together in the kitchen, the sun slanting across the table. Corinne asked polite questions about the neighborhood, the garden, the paint color. Darian said little, sipping his drink and scanning the house as though the walls might confess what I hadn't told him. When Mrs. Henderson passed by on her way to the mailbox, I waved her in, partly for comfort and partly as a shield. She joined us, cheerful as always, and immediately began praising the roses we had planted together. Darian softened his expression, nodding as though proud of me, while Corinne chimed in about how wonderful it was that I had such good company. In front of Mrs. Henderson, they performed the role of supportive family with flawless ease. But I knew that once the neighbor left, the masks would slip. After an hour, Ezra grew restless, tugging at his father's sleeve. Darian stood stretching. "Mind if I take him upstairs for a quick look around? He's curious." I hesitated, the protest forming in my throat, but Corinne was already nodding. "Go ahead," she said lightly. "It'll be fun for him." I watched them climb the stairs, my stomach tightening. For several minutes, I heard footsteps moving from room to room, doors opening and closing. Then silence. Too long, too deliberate. When Darian returned, Ezra was carrying one of my old books from the shelf in the guest room. "Grandma, can I borrow this?" he asked, holding it up with both hands. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, my eyes never leaving Darian's face. He smiled faintly, but his eyes flicked away too quickly, as though hiding something. They stayed only a little longer before Corinne announced it was time to leave. At the door, she kissed my cheek and whispered, "It really is a beautiful home. You must feel so safe here." Safe. The word echoed in my mind long after their car pulled away. When I went upstairs to tidy, I noticed the closet door in my bedroom was ajar. I was certain I had left it closed. My jewelry box sat on the dresser untouched, but the air in the room felt unsettled, disturbed, as if someone had been searching rather than admiring. I stood in the doorway, my hand on the frame trying to calm the rising unease. Had he only wandered, or had he taken something with him? The morning after their visit, I walked through the house with a heaviness I couldn't shake. Everything looked normal, but it felt wrong, as if the walls themselves remembered something I couldn't see. In the kitchen, I reached for my favorite mug, the one with a tiny chip on the handle, but it wasn't where I always left it. Instead, it sat on the opposite shelf, as though someone had put it away, without knowing my routine. I frowned, turning it over in my hands. I lived alone. There was no one else to move it. Later, when I carried the trash to the back, I noticed the garden gate swinging slightly in the breeze. I never left it unlatched. Mrs. Henderson and I both prided ourselves on keeping things neat. The roses along the fence leaned as if they had been brushed roughly by someone passing through. I tried to calm myself, telling my mind not to play tricks. Darian had been here, yes, but he wouldn't sneak back without telling me. He wouldn't, would he? That evening, I sat on the porch with Mrs. Henderson, watching the sky darken to lavender. She had brought over a basket of cucumbers and was slicing one with a small paring knife, handing me pieces as though we were girls at a picnic. "You're quieter than usual," she said, finally, glancing at me. I hesitated. "Do you ever feel like someone's been in your house when you weren't there?" She didn't laugh or dismiss it. She set the knife down and folded her hands. "Why do you ask?" I told her about the mug, the gate, the sense of disturbance I couldn't name. As I spoke, my voice grew sharper, almost desperate, and I hated how vulnerable I sounded. Mrs. Henderson listened, her eyes steady. Margaret, you need to put in cameras. They're not expensive anymore. I've got one on my porch. It helps me sleep at night knowing I'll see if anyone's wandering around. I shook my head. I don't want to live like that. Watching screens waiting for proof of something I can't even explain. It feels paranoid. She leaned forward, her voice firmer. It isn't paranoia if someone's really there, and from what you've told me, I wouldn't dismiss it. You live alone. People notice that. Family or not, boundaries can be crossed if you're not careful. Her words struck deeper than I wanted to admit. I stared at the roses lining our shared fence, their blooms closed for the night. I shouldn't have to protect myself from family, I whispered. No, she agreed softly. You shouldn't. But sometimes it's the ones closest to us who forget where the lines are. I went to bed unsettled, replaying every moment of Darian's visit. His footsteps upstairs, the open closet, the too quick smile when I caught his eye. Sleep came fitfully broken by the creak of floorboards and the imagined turn of a key in a lock. By morning, nothing had changed. The mug was back in its place. The gate closed, but the feeling clung to me like a shadow. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was letting suspicion poison what should be joy. Yet even as I watered the roses and watched the petals glisten, the question gnawed at me. Was I imagining ghosts, or did someone already hold my key? It was nearly 10 when I pulled into the driveway, the night air cool against my cheeks as I stepped out of the car. Choir rehearsal had run late, and my voice was still humming with the last notes of Ave Verum Corpus. I had been looking forward to slipping into bed with that calm tiredness that comes after singing. But the moment I cut the engine, I froze. Music drifted faintly from my cottage. Not the faint, tinny strains of a neighbor's radio, but full-bodied, pulsing through the walls. A man's laugh followed, loud and careless, carried out into the quiet street. I gripped my keys so tightly the metal bit into my palm. The curtains in the living room glowed with shifting light, as if a lamp or television flickered inside. My house, my sanctuary, was alive with sounds I hadn't invited. Slowly, I backed into the shadows of the oak trees at the edge of the yard. From there, I crept along the fence line until I had a clear view of the living room window. My breath caught when I saw them, shapes, moving shadows bending across the walls. Someone walked past the window, raising a glass that gleamed in the light. Then another figure leaned back on my sofa, head thrown in laughter. I crouched, low, heart pounding so loudly I feared it would give me away. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Strangers, burglars, celebrating their luck. Or something far worse, something that touched the raw nerve of the fear I'd been carrying since the day Darian walked upstairs alone. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, the music rising and falling, the voices careless, confident. They weren't afraid of being caught. They felt they belonged. Once a shadow passed close enough to the curtain that I thought I recognized the set of the shoulders, the tilt of the head, my throat went dry. It couldn't be, but deep down I knew it could. I wanted to storm inside, to flip on every light and demand answers, but my legs wouldn't move. I thought of Mrs. Henderson's words about boundaries, about cameras, about the people closest to us being the most dangerous. She had seen truth I hadn't wanted to admit. Instead, I stayed hidden, gripping the fence post until my knuckles ached. I counted the voices, 4, maybe 5, and tried to breathe through the anger building in my chest. My roses shivered beside me, their blooms trembling in the wind, as if the house itself was bracing against intrusion. After what must have been an hour, the laughter began to fade. One by one, the shadows disappeared from the windows. A door slammed somewhere inside, then another. The lights dimmed, and silence crept back like a guilty child. I didn't move until the night was still again. Only then did I step quietly to the back porch, slipping my key into the lock. I hesitated, listening. Nothing. No music, no voices. But the handle felt warm beneath my hand as though touched too many times in too short a span. I withdrew the key without turning it. My courage had carried me this far, but not inside. Not tonight. Instead, I retreated to the car, sliding behind the wheel, my breath shaking. I drove to the all-night diner on the edge of town, where I sat under fluorescent lights with a cup of coffee until the sky began to pale. Only then did I return, entering my own house as cautiously as if it belonged to someone else. The living room was spotless. No glasses, no crumbs, no overturned cushions. As if the laughter I'd heard had been nothing but imagination. But the faint trace of perfume lingered in the air. Sweet, sharp, unmistakably real. If my son was inside, how far would his betrayal go? 2 days passed before I finally gathered the nerve to mention it to Mrs. Henderson. We were standing by the fence, pruning clippings in the late afternoon sun, when I cleared my throat. I think someone was in my house the other night, I said carefully. Music. Voices. But when I went inside later, there was nothing. Her shears froze mid-cut. You should have told me sooner, she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. Because I saw it too, and I recorded it. My breath caught. Recorded. Mrs. Henderson nodded briskly and motioned me through her gate. Inside her kitchen, she set her phone on the table and pulled up a video. Grainy in the dusk, but clear enough my cottage lit up at nearly midnight, silhouettes moving across the windows. The faint sound of music and laughter carried through her open porch. I sank into a chair, covering my mouth. It was one thing to doubt myself, to chalk it up to nerves, but seeing it captured in pixels left no escape. I thought maybe I was imagining, I whispered. I didn't want to believe that family of yours, she asked gently. I nodded, shame prickling the back of my neck. I shouldn't accuse without proof, but who else would walk in so freely? She touched my hand. Margaret, doubting yourself is the trap. Proof or not, your gut already knew. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. I felt foolish for not trusting her earlier warnings. Foolish for pretending roses alone could guard a door. That evening, I called a security company. A young technician arrived the next morning, polite and efficient. I asked for cameras so small they'd melt into the corners, ones that wouldn't show from the street. He nodded. We'll put one above each entrance, one covering the yard, and another in your living room, all connected to your phone. I signed the contract with a steady hand, though inside I trembled. Watching my home through glass eyes felt like inviting fear to sleep beside me, yet I could no longer rest without knowing. By the end of the day, it was done. Tiny black lenses tucked above the porch light, beside the back door, hidden in the molding of my living room. Invisible, unless you already knew where to look. When the technician left, I walked from room to room, staring at the small, blinking lights on the control panel. My cottage no longer felt like an untouched refuge. It felt like a stage rigged with watchers waiting for the next performance of trespass. That night, I tested the app on my phone. The image was crisp, my roses swaying in the wind, my porch chairs empty, the living room silent. Safe. I watched until my eyes blurred, until safety became indistinguishable from loneliness. Before bed, I stood at the window, gazing across the fence. Mrs. Henderson's kitchen light glowed warm, steady. She had seen what I hadn't dared admit, and she hadn't turned away. I whispered a quiet thank you into the glass. As I closed the curtains, my phone buzzed with emotion alert. My heart leapt. Then I exhaled, when I saw it was only a stray cat darting across the porch. Still, my hands shook as I set the phone aside. I lay awake long after midnight, the faint red door glowing in my mind's eye. Cameras watched now, silent sentinels of truth. Would these eyes of glass protect me or show me something I couldn't bear to see? Travel had always been part of my life back when Harold and I used to take the car down winding roads just to see where they led. But this trip was nothing like that. It was only a short church retreat in Richmond, 2 nights, one sermon after another, hymns echoing through a hotel ballroom. Still leaving the cottage felt heavier than I admitted. I locked each door twice before I left, tested the cameras on my phone, and reminded Mrs. Henderson to keep an eye out. On the second night, as the choir finished a final verse and we dispersed to our rooms, my phone buzzed with the low chime I'd been both expecting and dreading. Motion detected. Living room. My breath caught. I sank onto the edge of the bed, fumbling for the app. The screen brightened, and the live feed snapped into focus. At first, I thought my eyes were betraying me. There was movement figures crossing my living room. Then the sound reached me. Laughter, loud and careless, spilling into my quiet home. I turned up the volume and froze. Darian. He was sprawled across my sofa, one arm stretched along the back as if he owned it. Corinne stood near the bookshelf, sipping from one of my wine glasses, her heels clicking faintly against the hardwood. Ezra wasn't there, but a cluster of teenagers, friends of his, I guessed, shuffled around, pointing at the photographs I had so carefully arranged. Music throbbed faintly in the background, the bass rattling what I knew was my coffee table. Someone lifted one of my framed pictures, Harold and me on our anniversary trip, and laughed before setting it down again. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. This was no accident, no harmless stop-by. They were comfortable too. Comfortable as though this house had been theirs all along. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Darian rose from the couch, walked straight to my kitchen, and opened the cabinet where I kept my mugs. He took one down, poured himself a drink, and carried it back as if it were his daily routine. A hand trembled to my mouth. Every suspicion, the shifted mug, the unlatched gate, was no longer a suspicion. It was truth, undeniable and brutal. Corinne clinked her glass against his, laughing at some joke. One of the teenagers shouted for more music, and Darian obliged, turning the dial higher. My walls shook, my roses shook, and still they carried on unbothered, untouchable. I felt something inside me fracture. This was not just trespass, it was betrayal. Betrayal that carried my blood, my name, and my trust straight into mockery. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, paralyzed. My son. My only son. The boy whose hand I had held across every street, the man whose future I had prayed over every night. He had taken my key, my sanctuary, and turned it into his playground. The phone grew slick in my palm. My chest burned with something I couldn't name. Fury, grief, humiliation. They blurred together until I couldn't tell which hurt more. I hovered over the dial pad, my thumb shaking. What would Harold have told me to do? To call, to forgive, to wait, or to finally draw the line? On the screen, Darian raised his glass, high toasting with the others. The living room roared with laughter. My laughter was nowhere in it. My thumb pressed down steady at last. Was it anger or heartbreak that made me reach for the phone to dial 911? The dispatcher's voice stayed steady on the line. "Officers are en route, ma'am. Stay on with me. Tell me what you see." I clutched the phone like a lifeline, staring at the live feed. Darian leaned against my kitchen counter, glass in hand, his voice booming above the music. Corinne had her shoes off, pacing around the living room, like a hostess, pointing out corners of the house to the group of teenagers and young adults who lounged on my sofa. "They're laughing," I whispered. Pouring drinks, making themselves at home. 10 minutes stretched like an hour before I saw the sweep of headlights across the screen. 2 police cruisers rolled to a stop outside my house. Officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting arcs across the lawn. The music stopped instantly. On the screen, Darian straightened his body, rigid. Corinne rushed forward, whispering furiously, her hands slicing through the air. The teenagers froze, their wide eyes darting between the front door and my son. A sharp knock rattled the camera feed. The front door opened and Darian appeared, his smile forced. He spoke quickly, gesturing behind him as though he could smooth the whole thing away with words. I couldn't hear, but I knew that tone. It was the same one he used at family gatherings when he wanted to appear in control. The officers didn't move. One pointed inside. They stepped over the threshold. The camera caught Corinne then. She stormed forward, her face flushed voice raised enough that I could almost feel the vibrations through the feed. She pointed at the officers, then at Darian, then at the room, her words spilling out in sharp bursts. Her movements grew wild, and one officer held up his hand to calm her. But Corinne wasn't calming. She jabbed a finger toward the camera itself, as though she could sense me watching. Then she reached for the officer's arm, tugging as if to prove a point. The officer stepped back. His partner moved in closer. The teenagers scattered into the corners like frightened birds. Darian grabbed Corinne's wrist, pulling her away, his face set in a mask of strained civility. I could read his lips when he finally turned to the officers. "This is my house." The words landed like stones in my stomach. My house. The one Harold and I had dreamed of. The one I had signed for in trembling triumph. Now out of my mouth but through his lips, claimed as though I had no place in it at all. The officers exchanged a glance. One pulled out a notepad, writing quickly, while Darian kept talking, his hands moving in practiced confidence. Corinne yanked free of his grasp, shouting again, and for a moment I thought they'd cuff her then and there. But Darian stepped between, lowering his voice, coaxing her back until her chest heaved. But her hands dropped. The scene looked orderly again, but I knew better. It was only a mask as fragile as the smile he'd worn on my doorstep weeks ago. The dispatcher asked softly, "Do you recognize them, ma'am? Do you know the individuals inside?" I closed my eyes, my throat burning. "Yes," I said. "They're my family." On the screen, Darian glanced toward the camera, his eyes sharp, almost daring. For a fleeting second, I felt like the intruder, not him, not Corinne, not the strangers spilling crumbs across my floor. Had my own son really turned me into an intruder in my own home? The call came just after dawn. An officer asked me to come to the station to give my statement. My hands shook so badly that I spilled half the coffee I'd poured. Still, I dressed carefully, pulling on a cardigan Harold had once loved, as if a thread of him could steady me. The station smelled of old paper and disinfectant. I was shown into a small interview room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The door clicked behind me, and suddenly I was alone with the sound of my pulse in my ears. It wasn't long before the door opened again. Darian stepped in, flanked by an officer, his expression taut but controlled. Corinne waited outside in the hall, her face blotched from crying, though she still managed to glare at me when our eyes met. The officer gave me a polite nod. "We'll give you a few minutes. Please don't leave the room." Then he shut the door. The moment we were alone, Darian leaned across the table. "Mom, thank God. You have to tell them this was a mistake, just a misunderstanding. Say you let us use the house, that you gave me permission." I stared at him, unable to speak. His words weren't desperate. They were rehearsed, smooth, practiced, as if he'd known all along I'd be the one to clean up the mess. "I didn't give you permission," I said quietly. "You know that." His jaw clenched. "If you don't back me up, they'll charge me. Charge Corinne. Maybe even Ezra when they find out about the kids who were there. Do you want that on your conscience?" "You put it on mine," I whispered. "Not me." For a moment, I thought I saw panic flicker in his eyes. Then it hardened into anger. He sat back, folding his arms. "You don't understand. I had no choice. No choice to break into your mother's house I didn't break in, he snapped. I had a key. My stomach dropped. What do you mean you had a key? He shifted, avoiding my gaze. That night, the housewarming, you left your keys on the counter. I made a copy. It was easy. The words hit me harder than any scream could have. I gripped the edge of the table, nails digging into the cold metal. You stole my key. I borrowed it, he said quickly. I was going to tell you eventually. I just thought. He stopped, swallowing. I thought if you saw how much we all loved the place, you'd realize it should be ours. A family home, not just a place you sit alone planting roses. My throat ached as though the air itself had turned against me. All the excuses, the lies, the warnings I'd ignored, they had led to this moment. My son calmly explaining how he had stolen his way into my life. I saved for years, I said, my voice low but sharp. This was my dream, mine and your father's. You had no right. He leaned forward again, urgency crackling now. Don't ruin this for us, Mom. Just tell them you gave me permission. Tell them you wanted us there. We can fix it if you just cooperate. I stood my chair, scraping against the floor. For the first time, he looked small to me, not the boy I raised, not even the man who once held Ezra in his arms, with wonder, but someone willing to strip me of everything just to claim more for himself. The door opened, and the officer returned with a clipboard. Mrs. Elowin, are you ready to give your statement? I nodded, my eyes never leaving Darian's. Yes, I said. I'm ready. As the officer guided me through the paperwork, Darian sat in silence, his face closed like a locked door. If he could steal my key, what else had he already stolen? After I finished signing the last page of my statement, the officer across from me set his pen down and leaned back in his chair. His expression softened the way a teacher might look at a child who doesn't yet know a harsh truth. Mrs. Elowin, he said carefully, you deserve to understand why this happened. We've looked into your son's background. There's more at play than just poor judgment. I folded my hands in my lap, bracing myself. Your son has accumulated significant debt. Gambling, mostly cards, sports betting. There are also indicators of loans not from banks but from less reputable lenders. People who expect repayment quickly and don't always ask politely. He paused. He's in trouble. Deep trouble. The words sank slowly like stones in water. Gambling. I thought of Darian as a boy carefully stacking his baseball cards in neat rows, saving his allowance for weeks to buy a glove. I thought of the man he became, calculated, precise, always projecting control. And yet here he was, building towers of debt behind my back. The officer continued, his tone steady. We believe he saw your home as an asset, a place to hold gatherings, a safe location away from his own address, maybe even collateral he could dangle in front of the wrong people. It wasn't about family time. It was about survival. His survival. I closed my eyes. The ache in my chest was unlike any I'd felt before. Grief layered with betrayal. I had told myself his intrusion was selfishness, entitlement, a grab for control. And yes, it was that, but it was also desperation. My son hadn't just stolen my key, he had tried to steal my safety net for himself. Mrs. Elowin, the officer, said gently, you don't owe him your house. Not your money, not your protection. He made choices and he'll face the consequences. But I wanted you to know the motive. I nodded slowly. My voice came out faint. Thank you for telling me. Walking out of the station, the morning air struck sharp and cool. I wrapped my cardigan tighter and let the truth settle into me. Darian wasn't only reckless, he was cornered. He had risked his family's dignity, my trust, even Ezra's peace, just to buy himself a little more time in a losing game. It didn't excuse him. Nothing could excuse what he had done. But the clarity pierced me all the same. He hadn't just been robbing me of independence. He had been crying out for rescue, a cry I was never meant to answer. Was it betrayal? Or a desperate cry I was never meant to answer? Here's in full prose 550 words, continuing seamlessly from the last chapter. The weeks that followed felt like waking from a fever dream, sweaty, shaken, and oddly clear. The court processed the charges quickly. Darian was fined heavily. Corinne received a formal warning for obstruction, and the whispers in town spread faster than wildfire. Their reputations crumbled under the weight of what they'd done. Ezra was spared the details, but children always know more than they're told. I wondered what he thought of the silence in his house now. As for me, I poured my energy into fortifying the life I had chosen. The locksmith came first, replacing every lock on every door, even the shed out back. I asked for reinforced deadbolts and watched each installation as though my eyes alone could guarantee safety. Then came the alarm system, louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. Each beep of the keypad became a small assurance that my sanctuary belonged to me again. But the house still carried scars. One morning, I stepped into the garden and found the roses closest to the porch bent, their stems crushed into the soil. I knew it must have happened during the party's careless feet stomping where beauty had tried to grow. The sight hollowed me. It wasn't just a plant, it was proof of how little respect had been given to the life I was building. I stood staring until Mrs. Henderson appeared at the fence gloves, already on clippers in hand. "Don't just look at the damage," she called gently. "Let's fix it." Together, we dug out the broken roots and laid new ones in their place. She showed me how to cut back the wounded stems so they could heal instead of rot. The soil stained our knees, and the sun pressed hot on our backs. But for the first time in months, I felt something grow lighter. When we finished, I sank onto the porch step dirt under my nails and sweat on my forehead. Mrs. Henderson set down her tools beside me. "You can't control storms, Margaret," she said, brushing soil from her gloves. "But you can decide what grows back after they pass." Her words settled deep. I realized then that reclaiming my garden wasn't only about roses. It was about reclaiming myself piece by piece, root by root. That evening, I watered the new plantings, watching droplets cling to the leaves like small jewels. The yard smelled of earth and possibility. For the first time since Darian's betrayal, I felt the balance tip toward hope. The cottage was not ruined. The garden was not lost. I was not finished. Still, when the wind rustled the fence, I found myself glancing toward the street, wondering what remnants of love could survive such shattering. Could love bloom again, where trust had died? Summer ripened slowly, and with it the roses I had replanted. Their buds opened in shades of cream blush and deep crimson spreading fragrance through the yard. Every morning, I stood at the porch with coffee in hand, watching bees hover and petals unfurl. It became a ritual, quiet and grounding. Life settled into its own rhythm. The alarm beeped dutifully. When I came and went, locks clicked into place with satisfying weight, and the cottage felt sturdier than ever. Even so, shadows sometimes lingered in the corners of my thoughts. I would catch myself listening for the sound of footsteps on the stairs or checking twice to make sure the gate was latched. Wounds take time to close, even when the surface looks healed. Darian tried calling, of course. The first messages were sharp, defensive. Then came softer ones, stitched with guilt, though still edged with excuses. I didn't answer. Corinne wrote once a clipped email full of apologies that never quite admitted anything. I didn't reply to that either. Ezra sent me a drawing of a red door with a stick figure beside it. That one I taped on my refrigerator because children tell truths adults are too proud to speak. Mrs. Henderson remained my anchor through it all. She shared vegetables from her garden, teased me into joining her for Sunday walks, and never once asked more than I was ready to say. Some evenings, we sat side by side on my porch, watching the fireflies flicker, speaking little. The comfort was in the silence, the kind that doesn't demand. One evening, while tidying a drawer in my bedroom, I came across the spare key. It lay on a small brass ring, cool and unmarked, a twin of the one that had been stolen from me in spirit, if not in shape. I held it in my palm for a long time, weighing its meaning. Keys are small things, but they carry trust heavier than any stone. Darian had shown me how fragile that trust could be, how quickly it could be twisted into ownership and control. Yet the thought of throwing the spare away didn't sit right. I didn't want to erase the possibility of trust altogether. I wanted to protect it, preserve it, keep it waiting for the right hands. So I locked the spare key in the drawer at my bedside. It wasn't for Darian. It wasn't for Corinne. It wasn't even for Ezra, though one day he might grow into a man who understood. That key was for someone who came to my door with respect, first, not expectation. For a friend, perhaps, or for the neighbor who had proven that loyalty can be quiet but steadfast. For anyone who remembered that entry was a gift, not a right. When I closed the drawer, I felt lighter. The key was not a burden anymore. It was a symbol of choice. My choice. Independence no longer meant barring the world outside. It meant opening the gate only when I wished to those who had earned it. As dusk slipped over the yard and the roses glowed faintly in the fading light, I breathed deep. The air smelled of earth, of blooms, of something alive and continuing. I still keep a spare key. Respect first, entry second. When respect finally knocks, do you savor it alone or open the gate to the world outline? Introduce Margaret Elowin. 66, widowed, retired teacher, lives in a noisy condo. She longs for peace. Remembers her late husband's dream of a quiet home. Twist early. While visiting a realtor, she notices her son, Darian, 38, at the same agency, quietly inquiring about homes. He doesn't see her. Hook. Was my son searching for a new home too, or searching for mine? Margaret decides not to tell Darian about her purchase. Introduces Mrs. Lou Henderson, 70s, a widowed neighbor with a rose garden, foreshadowing a bond. Hook. Could I really buy a house of my own without telling my only child? Margaret attends Sunday dinner at Darian's house. He lives with his wife, Corinne, and son, Ezra. When she mentions buying, Darian argues she should move in with them. He frames it as caring for her, but really, it's control. Hook. If even my own son thought I didn't deserve independence, who would? Margaret buys a modest white cottage with a red door. Description of location. Outskirts of Charlottesville, Virginia, quiet street. Big oak trees. She feels triumphant, but guilty. Hook. Was I planting freedom or a secret that would one day betray me? Margaret moves in, spends days in the garden. Symbolism, planting roses as rebirth. She meets neighbor Mrs. Henderson formally. They bond. Hook. Could this home ever stay mine if my family discovered it? Darian visits her condo unannounced, finds it vacant. Calls angrily. She lies, says she's staying with a friend. Suspicion builds. Hook. Had my son just accepted my lie or begun to unravel it? Margaret hosts a small, housewarming-only neighbors and trusted friends. She deliberately excludes family. Unknown to her, Darian learns about it via a distant cousin. Hook, who had whispered my secret to him, and what would he do with it? Darian, Corinne, and Ezra show up at the door uninvited. They act proud in public, but Margaret senses calculation. Later discovers Darian briefly went upstairs alone. Hook. Had he only wandered, or had he taken something with him? Margaret notices odd details back. Gate unlatched. Kitchen mugs moved. Mrs. Henderson advises cameras. Margaret resists at first. Hook. Was I imagining ghosts, or did someone already hold my key, returning late from church choir? She hears music from her house. Through the window, shadows laughter. She hides and watches, but doesn't confront. Hook. If my son was inside, how far would his betrayal go? Mrs. Henderson records video evidence lights on party noises. Margaret apologizes for doubting her. Margaret installs hidden cameras. Hook, would these eyes of glass protect me or show me something I couldn't bear to see? While away on a trip, Margaret gets an alert. Opens the app, sees Darian Corinne. Ezra's friends partying in her living room. Hook. Was it anger or heartbreak that made me reach for the phone to dial 911? Police arrive, confront Darian. He tries to claim it's his house. Rob-like character replaced Corinne becomes confrontational, nearly arrested. Hook. Had my own son really turned me into an intruder in my own home? At police station, Darian begs her to lie for him. She refuses. Revelation, he copied her key during housewarming. Hook. If he could steal my key, what else had he already stolen? Officer explains Darian's debt gambling, shady loans. He had planned to use her house as a safe place and asset. Margaret feels both grief and clarity. Hook. Was it betrayal or a desperate cry I was never meant to answer? Aftermath, Darian fined Corinne, a shamed family reputation. Ruined. Margaret changes locks, adds alarms, reclaims her garden. Mrs. Henderson helps her replant roses trampled by the party. Hook could love bloom again where trust had died. Margaret reflects on her independence, keeps one spare key locked in a drawer. Not for Darian, but for someone who respects her boundaries. Final line. I still keep a spare key. Respect. First entry second. Hook question to audience. When respect finally knocks, do you savor it alone or open the gate to the world?